a couple of months ago when the Department of Justice designated, kind of out of the blue, that there was a new domestic terrorist threat in the United States, right? There was a new domestic terrorist threat in the United States. That domestic terrorist threat was not lone white men who have been convicted of domestic violence who then go on to murder lots of people. No. Instead, that new domestic terrorist threat was something called Black identity extremists, right? So I want to talk to the panel about how this kind of follows on from the conversation that we have been having, and what it means. What it means in the sort of context of the conversation we've been having, but also concretely what it means and has meant for activism as well.
So when that report came out, it was not surprising to a lot of us who have been doing movement work when the FBI shows up at my grandmother's house 4 hours away and asks, do you know that your granddaughter is in Los Angeles, California, sleeping on the ground right now for an Occupy? Or, you know, when they show up in other spaces that you occupy, when you already know that you have an FBI file on you. We all have done this work. Everybody in my chapter has done this work, and we all have files. The American government is never interested in necessarily what you are doing, but who you are. And we see this, especially the most probably iconic for me to think of is Fred Hampton, right? Don't let there be another Black Messiah. He is dangerous because he can be a Black Messiah, because when he speaks, people listen, because he is able to empower and unite the masses to really see the way that oppression affects everybody in this country. Historically, when Black folks uprise, there is this automatic paranoia because there is the ongoing criminalization of Black bodies. So not just organizers, not just activists that are very visible, not the Opal Tometis of the world, but more so that everyday Black America is under surveillance. Going back to welfare, going back to folks who have to live in low impoverished communities, if you live in a New York City project, you are under constant surveillance, meaning the NYPD does not need a warrant to open your door because you are in a public government building. Meaning that if someone in your family jumps their turnstile, your family in public housing can be given permanent exclusion, which means that for jumping the turnstile for $2.75, your family can permanently be excluded from accessing public housing. Right, to the fact that there are floodlights that beam inside of project windows every single night from 10 p.m. to 6:30 in the morning. To that, I live directly across the street from what was media news of a Lower East Side white man had Confederate flags in his window, and that became a hyper thing, and white allies contacted me and said, we want to come down there, we want to do a light brigade sign that says Black Lives Matter right across the street from him, and we want to leave it there. And I said, well, what are your unintentional impacts? Once you come down and place that sign there, you go back to Brooklyn that you've now gentrified, and you go back to Harlem that you've now gentrified in our communities, right? What happens to the Black and brown people who live there every single day, that the police occupy their neighborhoods every single day? That just invites more surveillance, more violence, more occupation of the spaces that Black and brown people live in. So until there's this acceptance, not realization, because we know, but until there's overall acceptance and a movement towards really not surveilling people of color, which comes from the global aspect of the US when there's an NYPD headquarters in Israel, right? The NYPD trains Israeli soldiers, and they share information in order to learn how to occupy Black and brown neighborhoods. So it's not surprising that there's a COINTEL 2.0, as we call it, because it's constantly been happening, right? From the plantation of having an overseer, of not being able to leave the plantation until you have papers, and even those papers not being good enough to keep you free and safe. So there has constantly been a surveillance and a physical oppression of Black bodies that hasn't shifted, even in the digital age. It hasn't shifted. We have to take digital security, trainings, and we have to, everything's on Signal, and what do we actually know is encrypted and not, right? And so there's all these extra precautions and prevention measures that we have to take for what reason other than being black and disrupting the status quo and acting and asking and demanding for better quality of life of very, very, very basic needs, which go back to this like whole criminalization of black people, of the other, of the one that's taking away, who are the most impacted, the most oppressed, when you have black trans women who will never, whose life expectancy is 35 years, when you have black trans women whose salaries are $10,000 a year, when you have black trans women who 1 in 2 at some point will be imprisoned. All of these things are the criminalization of black bodies to say you don't belong here, and if you do belong here, here are the rules you have to play by, and anytime you try to disrupt those rules or disrupt the norm, then you have no power, you are powerless.